I'm the chair of this commission. We're delighted to be launching our interim report tonight. So 5 minutes worth of introduction from me, and then a range of different commissioners are going to take you through some of the key building blocks, the principles that we feel very strongly about in short order. We're going to try and do that relatively quickly, then have some chance for question and answer. And in a sense, if that's buzzing along, we can stay as long as you want. If not, we could buzz along and have a glass of wine and pursue that at the end of the day. I think that's sometimes the most productive way of doing things. Just a brief introduction, though, from me, in which I'm asked to particularly explain a bit about who we are and the journey that we've been on. When you look at the launch document that you've got today, you'll see that there's an interesting and varied group of people who are commissioners. And I think the particularly notable things about them, of which there are several really, are that these are people with substantial experience and knowledge about public services, for one, and for two, that they are people almost invariably with independent points of view. They're people who come from a range of different disciplines, which means that there's been a lot of variety. But not only that, and perhaps most interestingly with an election imminent, these are people from across the political spectrum. So in truth, we've been meeting for something over a year now, and holding ourselves together during that time has been an interesting experience for all of us. But the driving focus behind this has been interest and commitment in public services, as I like to say, as the cornerstone of civilised society, but how you improve them, and where the world currently is, and where it needs to go. And I guess one of the things that this group of people share in common is a sense that there's lots of strong commitment, lots of excellent people, lots of good work done in public services, but that somehow it feels as if we haven't always been making as much of the opportunity as we would want. And we wanted to take some time out to do a really serious look at where public services are and where they need to go. And without boring you with our process journey too much, over the last year, we've had 8 commission meetings where we've been debating things. But when you look at the document, and this is all available, we have in fact commissioned some 10 or so projects looking seriously across the range of public services and how they deliver. And then we've been debating those when they come back. We've also had something like 20 seminars of a variety of different sorts, based here at the RSA, as we are. And we have also done a substantial amount of polling of what citizens have to say themselves. Now, I guess we think that the political parties would sometimes benefit from doing that level of extensive looking that we have been doing. And what we've then wanted to do from a very substantial amount of work is to try and squeeze out some principles that stand from all of that looking. And what you have today in front of you is our interim report, which we very much want to engage with the world about, with some principles that we think stand out the future of public services need. And we've been very taken, if you look back at the tremendous history of public services in this country and how based it is on the Beveridge Convention. But when we look back and see that was commissioned by Churchill, written by a Liberal, in fact implemented by Attlee, it stands out to us very much that there was cross-party consensus, and look just how well that cross-party consensus has stood us, which is something that we feel is important for us right now. But I think that one of the things that stands out to us is that some elements of that convention, maybe for this next decade, are no longer as relevant, and that there is a mismatch, and care of the elderly, climate change, the internet world in which we live, so much has changed, and yet some of the basic convention hasn't. And we bring these principles forward today for a debate about whether this is time for a new set of principles behind public services. My colleagues are, in just a moment, going to share with you what those principles are. The last two things I'd like to say are that the way we've managed to reach agreement, and we absolutely have not agreed along the way of this journey, and this has not been a deterministic route, it's been a deliberative route, and it's been quite a struggle to get to where we are, but as you will hear from some of the individuals here, there is a lot of conviction behind these views. But what we decided to do was to bring out our principles before the election, try and encourage an elevated debate about the future of public services. I am for sure, critical about the shallowness of the debate about public services and its fixation with reduction and who will do it when and how, rather than what is the journey that we're going on, what is the nature of the society we want, what is the long-term strategic direction for public services, is what we're saying. And so what we've agreed to do is to then bring out, after the election to the next government, a report on how you would apply these principles in health, in law and order, in welfare, and in education. So before the election, a debate about the principles. After the election, in the months of June and July, 4 separate reports. Having engaged with people about the principles, having engaged with service users, having engaged with service providers, having engaged with politicians as much as they wish, we would then be saying those things. So that's the journey we're on. We're very serious about it. We're delighted you're with us here tonight. And Ben Page is going to start off, I think we believe appropriately, with some elements of the citizens' view, because at the heart of the vision we're putting forward is citizen focus, and any of you who are around public services will know that Ben makes his livelihood by doing that, and he's been coming and doing this with us pro bono, for which we're very grateful. Ben.
And it is, very quick. So copies of this, I think, are at the back of the room. But this is just trying to ask the question by looking at hundreds of different surveys, what people want, what they need, what do they expect from public services. I would just stress that I make no apology for being a survey researcher. That's what I do for a living. But we certainly haven't, in terms of the principles you're about to hear about, just given the public what they want, mostly because it's impossible. But it is worth bearing in mind where the public are, because there are certain things that everybody in this country agrees on. There are certain other areas where people are deeply divided, and I think it's important in thinking about a route map for public services to be aware of what those are. So I think the first thing is that Britain retains this very strong belief in universal provision and considerable anxiety about postcode lotteries, and we're going to and our media love various elements of this. The public love the idea of much greater control at the same time, and they like the idea of localism. And of course, there's a tension between lots of local control, lots of independence locally, and then of course postcode lotteries. But they do like those things. I think, although nudging is popular, and indeed the leader of the opposition recently gave a speech where he actually put up in his slides pictures of the leading behavioural economists as his guiding lights in terms of public service reform. Personally, I think, and what the evidence seems to suggest, is the public are going to need considerably more than a nudge to do some of the things that we are suggesting, but certainly there will be huge pressures that will nudge them. And the public, as you'll see, are pretty divided over the need for what the Treasury likes to call fiscal consolidation and the rest of us call cuts. And the public believe that we can make lots and lots of efficiency savings, and they're absolutely on line with the Taxpayers' Alliance on that one. We'll come on to that. And what that will mean, I think, is that whoever wins the general election, and it isn't quite certain, although I can tell you later if you want to know what I think, it will need very, very bold leadership, and that will mean the need for more what we would call adult conversations. And if you want to know what we mean by that, read the report, it's at the back. But generally there is a general thrust in terms of a movement of localisation, a movement of power away from the centre to citizens. But when you look at what the people themselves say about that, they certainly welcome the idea of localism. Every area in the world you go is different, so there'll be different circumstances there, and different people will be wanted by people living there. So to make everywhere unique in its own way, that makes perfect sense to me, what the public will say. But then, of course, if somebody in X has something that you don't have, or has sected in, and you don't have it, then, of course, there's a problem. But in principle, this is a good idea. Co-production, we know that the state on its own can't do everything, and many people accept that, but at the same time, we don't necessarily want to take individual responsibility for things. And both major parties, of course, keen to get people to do that, whether it's social action, social responsibility, etc., etc. I'd like to be saying, well, I'm not really happy with that, but, I want to do something about it. I'd like to be able to protest, but I'm quite happy that running the service is not my responsibility. Somebody else should go to the meetings and do it. And that, of course, is a key challenge. And how we renegotiate what citizens will do for themselves and what they expect a central state, which is strapped for cash, to do, is a key challenge. And I think this is the general issue, that although many people, including people in this room, and I think many people in the centre in policy making, right across the political spectrum, believe that everybody should be like us and spend their evenings in meetings like this, what we generally find with the public is that most of us have got other things to do. So if you take crime, an issue that keeps a lot of people in Britain awake at night, 4% of people say that they're already involved. That's probably just about everybody involved in the criminal justice system and their families, or maybe not even all of them. About 1 person in 20 says they want more involvement. A quarter would like a say. Perhaps they're going to elect a sheriff or a commissioner of police, as some people are suggesting. About half of us say we'd like to know more, but 16% say just get on with it. I don't want to hear about it. I want to go and watch the X Factor or something else. So some of us are very idealistic about the idea that everybody would like to come to meetings like this. We need to be honest and realistic about that. We're also, if we're going to have much more local control and empowerment, of course, the public start to worry about it, and some of the work that we've been doing for the Commission on sort of engagement and things, would everybody that mattered actually turn up? A lot of these things are hijacked by a certain power, the middle classes, and they've got their own agenda. They push through at the expense of everybody else. But, however you cut it, there is that anxiety that we need somebody else to arbitrate, because ultimately the people who turn up will make the decisions. Personally, I thought that was the idea of it, but that's certainly an anxiety amongst some members of the public. Other challenges, I think, and this, of course, is the nature of politics, of course, is trade-offs, but getting the public to realise they can't have everything, particularly with a fiscal squeeze, and particularly with the baby boomer generation passing through into retirement age and beyond, is a challenge. User charging would make you think twice about whether you needed that service or not. I'm talking about dependency. A lot of people depend on someone to assist them in every aspect of life, but maybe some independence would be a good thing. So knowing exactly how much you were getting from the NHS every year, these things have been suggested. But people being aware that they're actually, what they're running up might change things. But how comfortable would we be with that? We assume that many services just run like water at the moment. And when you look at people's attitudes, I think, again, it shows why nobody does this simply, because, of course, as Matthew Taylor always says, if there was a policy that was easy to implement, didn't cost very much, and everybody liked, it would all been done already. But, most people disagree that too much money is spent on public services, and we're completely divided, with 35% disagreeing that we demand a great deal from public services but aren't enough to pay enough tax to fund them, 36% who think we do agree with that. So our views on many of these subjects are not uniform, and I think that, again, makes it very, very hard for people in the centre. We believe at the moment, in terms of the sort of debt situation that we've got, at least 178 billion, depending on how you count it, that we can just make services more efficient. And that will save enough money to pay off the very high national debt we now have without damaging services the public receives. Now, there are very few people who are informed on this issue who would go along with that. And the challenge at the bottom, and I guess where the two main political parties are fighting, is over whether or not you agree that there is a real need to cut spending on public services in order to pay off the debt we now have, or whether you disagree. And again, it's one of those issues where we've got 43% who think you should, we've got 44% in November who think you shouldn't. The number who disagree has been falling, but it is, this is divided right down the middle. And in contrast, if we're looking at some of these services, belief in the idea of the NHS just doesn't vary, and about 80% of us are absolutely fundamentally committed to the NHS, almost at any cost. whether we actually want to start paying what the NHS would like to charge us if it was to go on expanding at the rate it has been for the last 13 years or so is another matter. But very, very divided, and I think that makes it very challenging. When you ask people which of these, if we take the NHS, perhaps one of the most expensive services, and you look at what people think might save the most money on the vertical axis and what they support as a policy, have a look at this thing here on the bottom left, which the unions will be delighted about, and then these things on the top right. So things that we think would be a good idea and save a lot of money, reducing the number of managers by a third. There really aren't quite as many as the public like to believe. More local control over health services, so you'll be able to decide whether you have a septin or a maternity unit next to your home, or whether you have a polyclinic or not. But freezing the pay of everybody who works in the NHS, the 1.3 million people, was a terrible idea, and we don't like that. Et cetera, et cetera. Fewer national targets and more local control. We think that's a good idea. I don't know if we mean scrapping the 4-hour waits or cancer referral times, but again, quite mixed views. And I think this shows some of the challenges that whoever is in charge will face. So overall, I think we do need to understand the public's priorities, but that doesn't take you that far. How much responsibility are people able to take, where and who? And that's something certainly the Commission will go on looking at. We do need, and what will happen after the election, I guess, will be more of a debate with the public about the trade-offs that might be necessary in order to do some of the things that we all aspire to. We do need more clarity on what is the absolute minimum that the public is willing to pay for in the situation that we now find ourselves. And I think the challenge is that simply one size won't fit all. I thought Nick Timmins' piece in the Financial Times on Saturday was interesting, where he looked at the NHS and said perhaps one of the lessons from the NHS, which does have the highest level of satisfaction we've ever measured with it at the moment, but does also have more money being spent on it there and a rate of inflation in the NHS which is completely unsustainable. But one of the things he observes is that a grand projet or a simple solution isn't the thing that has changed the NHS. It's been a variety of initiatives. But in all of this, in a more and more divided and fractured society, it probably becomes harder and harder for politicians to reach consensus. It's certainly been challenging for us as a group to do some of that, but we will carry on with it.
Thanks very much indeed, Ben. There are, by the way, 7 or 8 seats here. Why don't people who are feeling uncomfortable at the back come and populate these seats? There's 4 or 5 here, there's another 2 or 3 in here, unless you're really comfortable standing or want to make a quick getaway if you don't like the look of it. No, it's a phenomenon we all understand. There's 2 or 3 here. There are still other seats here for anybody who wants. Okay, the folk at the back there, you're okay? Couple of more minutes from me before I pass over to Hilary. I mean, just to say that the 3 principles that you're about to hear about are the result of the work. For those that arrived late, a description I gave is that we've been involved for over a year in 10 significant pieces of research, significant consultation with citizens, significant discussion with people in the field, and then we decided that what we needed to do was to determine some principles that we thought would be important if you were going to take a long-term strategic view to innovate in public services. And it was probably at that time we had some of our most challenging discussions. And the 3 principles, or the 3 building blocks as we called them, the shifts in culture that we feel is necessary in public services are at the heart of how we want to go on and look at other public services. And each of my colleagues is going to take you through one of those building blocks, and then we're going to have some question and answer. And if I just give you at least the headlines of them so that you can understand, we're saying that the shift in culture that's necessary is to put the citizen at the heart of how determination and decisions are made in public services. Might sound simple, but we're also very much talking about
playing to the strengths that citizens have in society, not just talking about what we don't have, not just talking about the element of citizens who don't want to be involved. If we are going to have a resource issue, how are we going to use the dynamic creativeness, the effectiveness of citizens in their communities in a variety of different ways? So the first principle you're going to hear about is there. The second principle, and we think these absolutely need to fit together, is about making decisions at a local level. Because if you really want to see much greater engagement of citizens, it's our belief that that has to happen at a local level, and there's a whole range of elements that then derive from that, which you'll hear about too from Claire. And thirdly, we're saying that if you want to get this engagement, if you want it to happen locally, there needs to be much greater transparency and clarity about how public funding is used. The phenomenon of people believing that their tax expenditure or government expenditure disappears into a black hole, and people feeling that they would be prepared to pay for some things if they only knew clearly what it was, and people feeling that the national insurance principle is degraded, and that there just isn't the transparency and clarity about who pays for what over their lifetime. And it's our view that a coherent approach to those three principles starts to give a powerful way over a medium to long period of time that you could bring about change in public services that could start to make them feel very much more relevant to the needs of today's world. So the next, or the first principle to be talked about, is going to be talked about by Hilary Cottam, who's the founding partner of Participle, a public service consultancy and social enterprise. Many of you will know Hilary, will know of her work, and she has been engaged in work that is highly relevant to the shift in culture, the building block that she's going to talk about. Hilary.
Thank you very much. Am I on?
You are. You probably need to move your microphone.
Okay, thank you very much. So, yes, I just wanted to make a couple of comments about the first building block, which, as Andrew says, is about a shift in culture from social security to social productivity. We mean two things, really, by this. The first is that we should stop concentrating. Am I okay? Should I carry on?
It's a wobbly mic.
It's like, I know, and I'm now going cross-eyed to it. But the first is that we should stop concentrating on the limited fiscal resource we have, which is what most of our conversation is currently about, and think instead about what we do have, which is very large social resource, and how we can work with that and bring that together. And the second is how we can shift the debate that we have in public services away from how we can improve services towards how we can really make a concrete difference in people's lives. Because I think what we know is that over the last 50 years, public services have really struggled to make real connections to people's lives, and not only provide a safety net, but much more importantly, begin to work with people instead of to do things to them, and move them along a path, a developmental path. So really what we're looking at is how we can redesign what we have to make this happen. And I just wanted to sort of draw on three examples really from my day job at Participle, where we are doing this, to talk about what this actually means in practice. And I think the first thing is that what we find working across Britain is that actually people really do want to make a difference in their lives, and they do want to contribute even in the most difficult of circumstances. So if I use as an example a project we've been doing in Swindon, as many of you will know, a year or so ago, maybe more, Gordon Brown talked about the fact that there are 100,000 so-called chaotic families in Britain, and that they absorb 80% of current social expenditure and take up 80% of social service capacity, basically. And we've looked at this. Swindon have about 1,000 of these families. They cost £250,000 a year. And what's really incredible about that is expenditure on a system, a gyroscope system, that spins around these families but doesn't actually connect with them in any real way at all. And these are families experiencing a whole range of difficulties. And what we found was that actually nobody had sat on a sofa ever, and these are families that have engaged for 3 generations with public services, and asked these families where they wanted to go. And when we had those real personal conversations and shaped something around those families, dramatic change started to happen, often in a period of about 10 weeks. So these are families that from the outside often look like they have nothing to give and to make productive, but actually I think they do. And the second thing I want to do is to draw on Circle, which is a new form of adult social care that's actually talked about in our interim report. And in fact, Daniel Dickens, who's the MD of Southwark Circle, is here tonight, so you can have a word with him afterwards. But we have designed basically a much cheaper, much better form of adult social care, working with 250 older people and their families. And what I want to say about this, what's very striking and perhaps speaks a bit to what Ben was just talking about, is that what we find is that if you just go and have surface conversations with people, they will tell you that they want to hang on to what they've already got, because we're all part of the existing system. So it's natural. If we feel that that's going to be taken away, we hang on to it, we hoard, we do everything we can, because we can't imagine in that moment what a different system might be like. But in this case, the minute people realised that we weren't from the government, they started to talk about what they wanted to give, what they dreamt of doing, and on the back of that, we've built a membership service. People join, people help. It brings together private, public and voluntary resource, so it expands the cake. And it's based on those very different conversations about how people want to lead their lives and what, therefore, they're prepared to give and to do in that very different situation. So that just leads me to my third and final point, which is that people will not participate and be part of something that is transactional. It has to be about relationships. It's not surprising that nobody wants to turn up to meetings or sit on boards and this and that. Of course they don't. Well, some people do, but they're quite a tiny minority, really. But if it is about relationships with people, about neighbourliness, about communities, actually the timbre of the conversation is very, very different, and people do want to get involved. This is about a big cultural change. So, of course, the fallout of this way of looking at things is that we need a different form of measurement. We need to think very differently about commissioning. We need to think about the role of the centre in how we design these participatory systems that bring people in, and we need to think about what happens at the front line, how we release frontline workers to build these relationships that are so important to this different way of designing public services. Thank you. I'll hand on to Claire, who will talk about number 2, I think.
Just a moment before
I introduce Dame Claire Tickell. I'm actually not going to tell you so much of what these folk have all done. I mean, read their CVs. They all have, in different ways, very extensive experience, knowledge about public services. Claire is, in fact, the Chief Executive of Action for Children. She's going to talk tonight particularly about the interest we have in how you refocus and have a shift of culture towards a more local approach. Claire.
Thank you, Andrew. Is this all right? Yeah. I'm going to have to move it over for you in a minute. It's a bit scary, though. What I'm going to talk very briefly about is localism and in a sense, a bit of a diagnostic about what we think the problems are and some of the issues that we've come up against and come up with in terms of solutions, and then talk a bit about implications. We have a report that's coming out on Tuesday, so in a sense, which will go into this in much greater detail. So I'm just going to give you one or two of the headlines from the top. None of this, for anybody who's working in public services, will come remotely as a surprise. And forgive us if it sounds blindingly obvious. Everybody's been talking about localism forever. I think we think that there is a real chance at this particular moment in time, for a number of different reasons, properly to grab hold of it and do something with it in a way that possibly won't come for a great deal of time if we don't do it now. The first, in terms of diagnostic, is that we absolutely operate within a massively over-centralised and controlled state. Also over-regulated, without any evidence that in actual point of fact that regulation and that control is giving us what we want and the safety that we want. We have hugely disempowered citizens, in part because of what's happened politically over the last year or so, but notwithstanding that, we are more disenfranchised, and we're all very uncomfortable about the extent to which we are. And there is too far between the very top and the very bottom, and not really enough exploration of what happens between the top and the bottom, or as I was reminded today by Jeff Masters to say, the bottom through to the top, because that's actually where we're starting from. The fourth very obvious thing in terms of diagnostic is that we are living in a nation where we are living in a country where there are three actually increasingly devolved nations. So we may be sitting in England feeling that we have this very, and experiencing this very centralised system, but actually in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, they're getting on with it, and they're experimenting with some stuff that we really need to be thinking about ourselves. In terms of solutions, starting point is we need to think about citizens first. We need to think about how we empower our citizens, and we need to shift the way that we think 180 degrees away. So we're thinking about how power flows from them, or indeed us as citizens, up and around. We need to think much more about how we can properly create individual budgets, neighbourhood budgets. We need to explore further a lot of the discussions that are taking place around mutualism properly, not as a sort of electioneering thing, but deeply and properly, and understand what it really means. Absolute necessity for us to think about a plurality of providers. It's not voluntary sector or private sector or public sector. It's actually how do we create something and make best use of commissioning, not procuring services from a plurality of providers with citizens' needs and wants at the very heart. At the risk of stating the blindingly obvious, this involves different behaviours. We absolutely recognise that we didn't start this work knowing that the recession and the public finances were as bad as they were over such a time period. We absolutely know that now, and we're not thinking about localism as something that needs to ignore the public finances. The issue for us is thinking about how we can make localism work, particularly and explicitly because of what's happening in the public finances, and that there is an imperative so to do. So a lot of the thinking about single budgets, some of the good stuff that's coming out of Total Place, which expects people locally to work in very different ways, so that they again put citizen at the centre and think about how to harness resources cost effectively and efficiently in the interests of those citizens. Really, really important, determined by those citizens. And one of the things that we'll talk about in the report that comes out on Tuesday is introducing this notion, a notion of negotiated autonomy. So we think that local authorities, good local authorities who are doing interesting, innovative things using these sorts of principles, should be allowed to negotiate elements of autonomy from the Treasury on the basis that they take slightly less money, but they have autonomy over outcomes which they've negotiated with the Treasury. Implications of this are that in order for us to give citizens more from them flowing up, we need to have a smaller and a much more enabling centre. Huge bureaucracies that are sitting in lots of different government departments, measuring and ticking boxes, aren't going to work. We can't afford it anyway, but actually they're not working. We need clearer accountability and clearer expectations as citizens about what we get for our money, both locally and also from the centre. We absolutely recognise that this raises huge issues around fairness, around equalities and around communities of interest, which aren't necessarily going to be defined by geographical locality, but we need to address that and think about it. That's not a reason to walk away from it. That's a challenge and one of the tests that we need to use. And just finally, this is challenging. There are particular pressures because of public finances. We think that the deficit and the problems that we have in public finances provides us potentially with a huge opportunity properly to do this, if for no other reason being cynical, that actually if you're sitting in central government and you're really quite alarmed about what's going to happen, if you shove it off locally and actually allow that degree of self-determination, maybe then that will allow that kind of environment and the oxygen for it to happen in a way that possibly hasn't been around for quite some time.
And finally, a chance for me to introduce Bridget Rosewall, who's chairman of Volterra Consulting. Bridget is an economist by background. We have a range of different disciplines and represented in the Commission, and having someone focusing on how the money is used, what the efficiency and effectiveness was, and how clear it is, has been something that's very valuable. And Bridget is going to talk to us about the use of resources.
Thank you, Andrew. The title of this little piece is about reconnecting finance with purpose. And really, I think that's about partly knowing what the finance is and what the purposes are. I was brought up to believe that the idea of public services is that money was taken away from a very large group of people and given to a very clever set of people sitting in Whitehall who would be able to decide what the best things were to do with that big pot of money. And it wasn't up to those persons providing the money to have the knowledge about how that broke down. And I think the problem with that model is that it actually hasn't worked, because what it sets up is a whole set of incentives to produce incoherent views about public services, which Ben has very well described about how, of course, we would like something more for the money that we're paying, and we do believe there's some more efficiencies, but we also want these things, and after all, why would you give it up? And one of the big reasons for that is because actually you don't know what you're spending it on. You don't know how much of your money goes to the National Health Service. And indeed, if you try and find out how to kind of how money is distributed amongst different kinds of families, we published some work on that. It was quite a difficult task to get a feel for what the production was in terms of how much you gave and how much you got for different kinds of families. But that's the kind of thing that government ought to be making very clear to all its citizens. Even worse, if you try and do that over the life cycle, how much taxes did you pay for the pension that you might get at the end? Do you understand that? Does anybody understand that? Even if you're quite sophisticated, it's hard to understand. Does the government make it easy? No, it certainly does not. It'll ring you up and tell you whether you've paid enough stamps, but even that is pretty difficult. So you can't have accountability, as Claire's been talking about it, if you don't understand where the money is coming from and then where it's going, how much of it are you providing. So that key element in the accountability, whether it's localism or whether it's a shift in culture, in my view, cannot happen without getting a much clearer set of accounts, reports, and information that comes through to make that accountability real. Not just at a top level. When it's very interesting, I find, when I talk about transparency with public service workers, they do talk a lot about how that would incentivise better efficiencies within the organisation and within the service organisation, but it's very hard for them to talk about how that incentivises or affects the willingness of people to pay for it, or indeed the behaviour of citizens. We tend to keep forgetting about the citizens. So I think that we need to, if we're going to make this bottom-up approach work properly, we need to connect much better with the citizens and the information that they need.
Thanks very much indeed, Bridget. So now there's a chance to take some question and comment. Doesn't necessarily need to go on a long time. Maybe I'll take 2 or 3 questions. Well, I don't want people to feel they're caught here longer than they wish. Maybe take questions in 2 or 3. It would then be helpful if people's questions were relatively short and if people introduced themselves. So, who would like to start? There's a guy here. Have we got a mic, or maybe? I think you. I don't. Yeah. There's a.
John Slater, I'm chairman of the Carno Foundation, but
Yeah.
for over 30 years I was a police officer. One of the things I think that has happened over the last 40, 50 years is throughout the public sector is a significant increase in accountability. The kind of information that one could get, the kind of accountability of over the 1940s, 1950s would be completely unacceptable by today's standards. But I think amongst that, there's a number of factors. Number one, we have a voracious legal system which causes that accountability and delivering of that accountability to prove inordinately expensive. Point number two, I think there is confusion within the civil service and in local government between the need to deliver accountability and the need to deliver responsibility. I don't think the difference is understood. And having worked in 34 countries in the rest of the world, other than the UK, looking at local government and democratisation, there's an awful lot of functions around accountability that can be delivered by citizens as volunteers, rather than paying people 50, 60, 70,000 a year, plus the cost of lawyers, to deliver the accountability. And very often that accountability is that expensive because it's muddled up with responsibility.
Thanks very much indeed. I'll take a couple of other questions and then we can answer. David.
David Henke, freelance journalist, former better quality of service is their top priority, and actually they're not bothered about choice of treatment. So have both major parties been totally wasting our time ever since Mrs. Thatcher said private health care was because it was a matter of choice, by foisting on the public things they don't want? That's both the Labour and the Tory parties claiming that everyone wants choice. You seem to have knocked this out and actually saying what I often feel is people want a safe service with a good quality and aren't bothered about having vast lists of hospitals and other places to go.
One more question. Was there another one around? No? Okay, guy here. Can you just speak up, yeah?
Anthony Zachszewski, I'm occasionally a local government officer.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say I think localism is a fantastic idea. It does rely on very high quality of both political and officer leadership at local level, which although in my council obviously we definitely have, I wouldn't say otherwise, is perhaps not available everywhere. How do we get there from here?
Okay, why don't we take some comment from those who are interested. The first guy, Jonathan Slater, I think, commentary was about accountability, about citizens as volunteers. Who would like to comment about that? Bridget?
Perhaps make a couple of comments about a couple of the questions. I agree that accountability and responsibility do get muddled up. But I think that one of the reasons that they do is because we separate out the costings and what people are paying for on the one hand and what people expect on the other hand. Litigiousness, I agree, is a fundamental problem we need to kind of deal with. But I'd just like to come back on the choice point as well, because I think that also has to do with this, that people do indeed say, I don't want choice, I just want a good service. But what they also need to realise is that choice is one of the drivers of a good service, because otherwise what you get is producer capture, which comes back to then getting no responsibility and no accountability, because you simply will get whatever service somebody else decides that you want. People don't want that either.
How about Ben? Do you want
To respond to the Henke point?
They don't say choice is top, but they don't mind having it. But I think the point where the problem has been is that, as Bridget has correctly analysed, choice is a good mechanism in a monopoly system to try and put pressure on monopoly producers. The difficulty, I think, for the politicians is they've sold us as an end in itself rather than a means to an end, and that's where some of the problem has crept in, because ultimately, knowing that that your hospital will go out of business isn't any good. It's still a bit disappointing if you live near that hospital, if the choice mechanism is achieving that. So it's not attractive, and I think they just they missold it, basically, is my view. But it's not that people don't like it on its own. But why wouldn't you like it? But it's not. It's a means, not an end. Just this point on accountability. I think one of the answers about true localism is we have to accept that bad things will happen. I think we are honest about that. So localism means that we will put incompetence in charge. But the Audit Commission, which is an organisation I love, and CPA personally I quite like, of course won't necessarily be there in that way to come and ride in and stop things. But this is whereas in the past the good voters of Lambeth and Hackney didn't actually go and do anything about it, and it did take, my view, central intervention. I know other people in the audience may disagree, to fundamentally change things there rather than the electorate. Under the sort of localism we're proposing, actually people will get pretty. This is, and it depends on your view. Bad things will happen, and that will also perhaps deal with some of the accountability issue, because you will be very clear who is responsible. It won't be always the Prime Minister having to have a summit on knife crime in Number 10, because ultimately it is about this community and the solutions we've got here. But it's not going to be an easy. I don't think we're proposing universal happiness.
I just would want to add to that. I mean, having worked around the centre of government for quite a while, I have absolutely seen both major political parties promise so much localism when in opposition, and then I've watched those same parties when in power, with all the trappings of power that come, failing to let go. And so our history is of actually building more influence and authority to the centre and never being prepared to let go. And the theory, everybody understands what the theory is, and it is exactly what Ben has said, that if you want to make it vibrant, if we want, the Today programme is full of stories about how concerned we are that people don't vote. Well, if you want people to vote, presumably it is that they need to think it's going to have some influence over something. And the influence would need to be that you let go of some power and influence from the centre, and then you do have to think some things have to go wrong, and people have to think that there's a remedy that they're going to change. So one of the reasons I believe why we're pushing this is that if you really want to engage citizens and communities, you'd need to let go to those communities, and that's the chance of doing it right. It's also the chance of making mistakes and it being rectified at a local level. And it seems to me that is a fundamental principle. I don't know whether you want to add on the localism points at all, Claire?
The localism point, I can't say better than Ben. On the accountability and responsibility point, though, this might be taking us slightly over to the side, but we had a conversation before we came in, the three of us actually, about the differentiation between, we were talking about safeguarding children, and the differentiation between overwhelming people working on the front line to such an extent that in actual point of fact their ability to stand back as practitioners and join with other practitioners and think about the safety and the welfare and the well-being of a child and the family surrounding that child was diminished by the suffocation of people feeling that they are simply accountable only, but actually not having to think properly about their responsibility and the difference that they can make. And that's what we mean about changing behaviour and people thinking differently about how it is that they engage and how it is that they take some responsibility and control of their own lives as citizens, and actually how central government needs to change its role into something that is much smaller and much more of an enabling thing than we have at the moment.
No. Okay, maybe is there one more set of questions? I mean, we've got loads of ex-Guardian people here. Nick?
Not ex-Guardian, though.
Yes, I know, but I knew it would wind you up.
Sorry, Nick Timmins from the Financial Times. Ben may have covered this, I'm sorry I was late, but how worried is the Commission if you look at Ben's polling? The public's not remotely interested in any of these solutions that you're touting. I mean, they all, they sort of think localism is a nice idea, but not if I have to do it. Someone else can do it for me. I'm not interested in getting involved. So you've got all these great ideas for reforming it, and the public doesn't want to know. Does that worry you?
Other questions too? There's a lady here. No, we're gonna have three. It's a well-known device.
Helen John, I'm a civil servant. You talked a little bit about the creative tension between localism and postcode lottery. Are there some things that people actually feel should be national? And yes,
Okay, so postcode lottery, and there's stacks coming through now. There's a guy here, there's a woman here, and then there's a lady here. So.
I'm just looking at this idea of localism from their perspective and management. It strikes me that it's almost impossible because taking Ben Mother, for example, prisons are run nationally, prisoners move from one end of the country to the next. And how do you practically propose to try and ensure that local authorities have control of that if something is Ben Mother?
Okay, there was boom. Actually, maybe we were at three. We'll do those three next. So there was the Timmins. This is a load of tosh statement. I'm sure he'd put it more eruditely in his column. Who wants that? But you've got Hillary going.
I think, Nick, did you also miss what I said? Yeah. Which we, I can't believe it. He wasn't there. Straight to this point, which is that I think we see this again and again, which is that if you engage the public within the constraints of current service delivery, they're not interested in engaging. So that, if you ask people to come to meetings or to do things that they perceive that they're paying the state to do, then they don't want to engage. I also think we need to say that there are some things like picking up your bins, which we also know that people just want done efficiently. And then there are other services which are highly relational, where people do actually want a very different provision, but at the moment they don't know what to ask for. So earlier I was using the example of our adult social care, which is that people are trapped in complaining about what they've got because they are not part of a kind of dynamic debate about other examples of things around the world, other ways that things might be done. But what we see, and I don't think we're alone in this at Participable, I think we can see this from many different examples, countries, sectors, is that if you build something different that is genuinely participatory and is built on what people want rather than what you're telling them they should need or how they should participate, that the change of the debate is very different. And I really would like to invite you, Nick, to come and see what we're doing and how this is working in practice. But can I also move on to a couple of other issues? I think that there's an issue about national spine. So even in some of the examples I was talking about earlier, is I think that we, in this kind of cultural shift, we have to decide what can we build nationally, and then how can we distribute local solutions off it. So again, if we talk about Circle, which is in our interim report, there is a common technological spine that enables very different things to happen for very much lower cost. That is something that needs to be national, and then we can think about what are the kind of branches off that are highly localised. So I think we need to think in a much more sophisticated way about that. And can I finally go towards
Please.
Prisons?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've done quite a lot of work on prisons. I mean, I think prisons need to be run basically like head teachers that are in charge of their prison and can decide what to do. But I also think we can look again at how we can think differently across the kind of estate of who's there. One example I've got, one concrete example is, I don't know if you know, there's a very interesting program in the Netherlands whereby young offenders are basically replaced into schools. Schools get 50% of the budget that was around having people in secure institutions, which is of course much more than goes on a person's head as a school pupil. And local authorities and schools are delighted to accept back with the price tag, and the centre also makes a saving. Actually, I've had the experience of lobbying central government with a local authority and a set of schools to see if we could make that happen in Britain, and currently we can't do that. But I think those are exactly the sorts of things that we want to open up the discussion about now.
So there was the postcode lottery question. I don't know if anybody
Well,
wants to speak to that.
I think what we will move on to as a commission, I think, is that on the postcode lottery, clearly that's a bad thing. And one of the things that we found in research is if you actually ask people what they would like guaranteed as a minimum standard, they will actually go right down to sort of the level of the grass cutting in the park. If you offer people the idea that the government will guarantee that everything will be the same everywhere, they tend to be attracted to it. But at the same time, Nick, of course, and this is what we tend to call cognitive polyphasia, the ability to think conflicting things about the same thing at the same time without any dissonance. They also like the idea of much greater local control, and the problem with voting is that the government always wins and everything's always the same. I don't vote in local elections because it never makes a difference. So I think we're saying, well, actually it might start to make quite a big difference, but at the same time we would need a debate as a country, and that's part of our reference to Beveridge, that actually we need to, given the funding situation that we're facing, given the rising cost of many of the services, and possibly rising expectations as living standards have improved, we are going to have another look at what the state would guarantee as a minimum, and what would need to be done, where people would have to take a bit more responsibility if they didn't want to pay more tax, which they certainly don't. So I think that debate is to come, to be quite honest, but we're prompting it before the general election. And on offender management, I think we do need to look around. In France, for example, as I understand it, there is far more local control of prisons, and of course we used to have a local probation service.
Okay, can we just take maybe one last chunk of questions? There was a woman here, and there's another woman here, and Lucy there, and then so that's the first three. So would you like to come with the first question? Fine, so there's a lady here.
I'm Jodie Bird. I adjudicate on complaints about public bodies and the audit function.
Yeah.
If you're going to put citizen at the centre of services, it implies public services have to work very closely together to make that happen. And if you're going to do it nationally, it implies they have to do it at all levels of the civil
So, and then I'm just trying to think. It was Lucy was third. Yeah.
I think the things you're proposing sound very stimulating. They, as you rightly said, they're not all completely uniquely.
No.
That doesn't mean that's not all good stuff. The bit I'd like to say is, why is it going to be different? I mean, dare I say it? There was something called the Lions Report about 5 years ago. I can't quite remember. Talked about postcode lotteries. I have a feeling, Ben, you did quite a lot of research about it. There's quite a kind of erudite chapter in it about the debate about I think we had local PSAs, if I remember right, I think it was about 2001. It was all about local autonomy, We've had how do we do joined up, this, that, and the other. I think it was the PIU report about 1999. So the key thing was that central government needed to join up better. It created these silos which made life impossible locally, and all the rest of it. I suppose the interesting question is, why is it different now? How can we collectively make it different now? Particularly with the greatest respect to our friends in and around the media, because the short-term responses from the public, your disconnected what's its name, are actually that it's very easy to play to the last bit of prejudice you last heard. And I think that, I suppose what I find, I find it really stimulating that you're bringing all these ideas together, but I'm very slightly, maybe I was getting too long in the tooth, I just slightly think, how can we make it different this time, given the degree of cynicism about the overall political process?
Fine. So the first question was about inequality and choice and voice. Who would like to? Claire?
It's a really good question, and it's one of the things that we keep coming back to in the Commission, actually, about, and I wouldn't pretend, and I hope none of my colleagues would come in and say we've cracked it. I think, and actually we talked about it today, we talked specifically, particularly about the equality and cohesion stuff, and we were describing it as describing its stickiness in terms of how it is that we engage with it. On the specific piece of work that we've done on localism, I think we've got as good as recognising the stuff that I said right at the end of the piece that I was talking about, which is the notion of fairness is really, really important that we have to hang on to, and we need to think about and we need to explore what fairness means. And if we're properly to think about how it is that we transfer power in the way that we're talking about it. A critical litmus test of that is to make sure that the most disenfranchised and the people who are the most vulnerable within this are the people that there is a mechanism to ensure that their needs are met and that they have voice in there. And we haven't answered this one, and I don't know what the answer is. This issue around community of interest, where actually sometimes you have to go way above total, a definition of place to get a sufficient community of interest to engage properly with and to exercise that voice. Which is why I talked about it's not just a question of what sits at the top and what sits at the bottom, but I'm really interested in what sits between the top and the bottom. I think that architecture is really, really important. It's not one or t'other. It's the path between the bottom and the top. Sorry, Jeff.
Hilary, I don't know if you want to speak to the citizen focus question that the woman here mentioned.
It also speaks a bit to the question that Lucy was asking, which is that, I haven't worked in Britain on these issues for nearly as long as you have, Lucy, but so I'm sure there's kind of stones unturned there that we don't know, but I do think that something is fundamentally different in the kind of cultural power shift that we're suggesting, because I think there's been lots of attempts, for instance, to bring services together from the top down, lots of command about how everybody must work together. I don't know, apart from very small pockets of experiments that haven't been systemically connected up to now, how much real experience there has been of actually working from a citizen's perspective to see what needs to be joined up. Not in terms of like, okay, now let's look at the citizen and see what already exists that we're going to bring in, but rather actually what is needed. Let's have a complete rethink here about what is needed and what will come in around that citizen. And I think that also speaks to some of the things that you're talking about, Lucy. I mean, I'm just not sure that the last 20 years of debate haven't been about existing services and how we make them better, rather than what is the bigger purpose that we need to reconceive the welfare state for now, 50 years on, and how do we start from the bottom up to make that happen?
And how do we join citizens in that process rather than doing to? which is...
I'd like to add to that, in as much as that I've been around for many of the things that you just described too. And I think that the best that I can think of is that actually times of financial crisis and adversity maybe give an imperative for change that otherwise doesn't exist. I mean, I think that's one thing. I mean, we didn't actually start doing this work for that reason, but we do believe that the demands, whoever's the next government is going to have to meet, that there is maybe a call for some more fundamental rethinking than will have happened for a long time, is one thing. The second thing is that we feel very strongly that the three building blocks, shifts in culture that we described, have to be seen as a coherent package. And frankly, much that I and many people in the room have been involved with many other changes, it actually looks to us that much of the change that's gone on in the Beveridge system and subsequently has been incremental, ad hoc. And if you really take the 12 months look that we have, we really do have a range of systems whose coherence to each other looks very higgledy-piggledy, hodgepodge, and without coherence. So our best hopes, I mean, unless you take the Timmins Council of Despair, argument, nobody can do anything, the citizens aren't interested. Well, I mean, I don't take that Council of Despair. I actually say, during a time of financial crisis, and with a coherent set of principles, if you engage in a serious way with people, you do at least create some chance. What a right of reply.
Not my Council of Despair, Ben's polling.
Okay. I guess there is the way that one reports the polling that can affect it. One last set of questions. There was some folk over here. There's this guy here, yeah.
Yeah. Ask about next steps and how local authorities or people commissioning might embrace risk and how they might measure return differently to enable some of these things to happen.
Fine. Thanks. Other questions, comments? There's a guy at the back here. Okay, and the last question. It's difficult to choose. The woman here. Thank you. Yes. There's a range of our staff at the back. Our contact details are on the back, but there's if you just turn around, if staff from the Secretariat can put their hands up, and then there's also maybe if commissioners can put their hands up too. There's other commissioners around and about the room, and one of our calls, absolutely, in my wrapping up, would be our whole point is wanting to engage with people who are interested, and we have a strong sense that there is a community of people who is interested and does believe there's a different way of doing things that is respectful of much of the history of what has gone on, as not into slagging off, but is into how you develop and how you're looking for consensus. Sorry, we've started answering the question, haven't we?
The other thing we are going to work through the principles now, looking at public safety, looking at health, looking at welfare, looking at education. And I think, and be quite honest, we're going to just test it to destruction, because clearly there are different levels for local solutions. There are certain things that will have to be, we will always want as a society to be guaranteed absolutely to everybody. But there are other things where clearly perhaps the centre doesn't manage it, and we just need to be clearer about what those are, and it is an appropriate moment perhaps to have that conversation.
So if we can just quickly go through those questions. The first one was about risk. I don't know, Bridget, do you? No?
These are very wobbly, aren't they? On the question of risk and return, I think it also relates to the one-size-fits-all question, actually, and our ability to cut things up into an appropriate geography, sectoral areas, and create then mechanisms in which you actually have the chance to, in fact, look at what the risk might be, or indeed the return might be. And the attempts to kind of remove risk have, in fact, created this huge edifice of centralisation, which in fact doesn't deliver what people think or hope that it would deliver. So to me, the answer to that question is to create some processes, effectively, by which you can start to grow into a world where risk and return could conceivably be measured. And I think that, for me, that also comes back to your question about effectively the institutional capacity to do that. So I don't think that this commission will be able to come up with some kind of blueprint for how this is going to be done, because apart from anything else, that has to actually grow in capacity within those institutions and those organisations. What I hope we can do is to suggest that there is a very different way of thinking about these solutions, and starting with outcomes and with citizens, rather than starting with organisations and services and a set of silos. And hopefully by doing that, we will begin to cut into the ability to do this in a different way and look at those risks and look at those returns in a different way. I don't think that's easy. In fact, I think it's bloody hard. And it'll involve the engagement of everybody who is doing this kind of things, and their willingness to engage with it in a different way. I just hope we can produce some catalyst thinking along that. So I don't have answers to some of the questions, because I don't think anybody could have answers to all of those questions. And if we did say that we had answers, then you should distrust us.
The next question was anybody wanting to respond to the typology public services point?
One size doesn't fit all, whether it's localism or centralism, and but we are just proposing. I think the point about, yes, we've all been talking about localism with ever louder voices over the last decade, and everybody in opposition always likes it, and then beaten up by the media, something must be done once they're in power. I guess we're just saying, let's just try and work it through and run it as it's clearly a principle that, and given that the state grows and grows and grows, it's not working and it's unaffordable. We will need some solution. If you want to have an entirely devil's advocate point of view, of course, if you look at some of the fiscal consolidation done elsewhere in the world, often it involves, giving more responsibly back to the locality and then cutting the funding to let them be very creative.
Can I add something to that?
You're pleased, Claire.
Completely agree with what Bridget says. But I mean, if we were saying these are the answers, not only mistrust us, we're kind of not doing what it is that we're saying is really important. One of the things that's come through we've done some work with Manchester and with Birmingham, we've looked at a number of the total place pilots. One of the things that comes out of that is that you don't go for one definition of localism, and you know, you pay your money, and actually what people do is, depending on what the issue is and the problem is, or what it is that they're trying to address, they join up with different partners. That's challenging, and it's challenging certainly when you're trying to tick boxes and measure everything and regulate everything, because it isn't doesn't lend itself to that. But that's kind of the point, and that is to be celebrated, I think.
And can I just add one point on that, which is that what I want to say about that is that, sorry, is it not is that actually, although you are right that those families are a typology, the secret to real change rather than a safety net is actually providing connections to lots and lots of people that are not like them, and that's what our services currently don't do. So we do need to understand that, but then we need to build very, very different connections. And in order to do that, what we partly need is a very different macro narrative in which we can ask those conversations and talk about these things in very different language, not the kind of punitive language we have to talk about it at the moment. And I hope that, of course, I also agree with Bridget that we can't have the answers, but one of the things we can do is not only set out some different ideas, but also hopefully stimulate a very different debate and way of talking about these things. And if we can do that, I think that in and of itself is very important.
So the one question that I think we haven't responded to is the housing regeneration points that the woman...
Oh, well, I just thought it was completely fantastic to add in, and I just think the more people that can do that and the more we can have the dialogue and have the examples. Is that right? I mean, that's just fantastic.
It is. So I think... Anybody?
Ideas we've got, then the more different, you know, bottom-up ways we can address these things, the better.
Close that, and thank you very much indeed for your time, energy and effort in coming and sharing thoughts back with us. It's felt to me, you know, very informative and a very valuable conversation from our point of view, and I just want to reiterate what we're saying here. Our contact details are available for us. How we then go on to take this work forward absolutely needs engagement with people who know and are interested. But at the heart of it, we are looking to try and persuade that at a time when there is major financial crisis, there is maybe a bigger opportunity, that this maybe is a time when we revisit, you know, the long history we've had based around Beveridge, and that maybe it is time to think of a different convention which is much more relevant and much more coherent. And we are absolutely arguing, you know, differently to where modern politics is, which is always so short-term, which is long-term, strategic, directional, and encouraging innovation. And frankly, I think we're on the high ground of that. It may not be how it has been, but it is a powerful argument to make, and I think it deserves to be made and made and made again, because it is in the public interest, and our public services do need to have a more coherent approach to them that is more strongly related to the need of citizens. And I think that just deserves to be said and said again in the most interesting way, and to seek to persuade people about that. And that is what we're trying to do. Do come and have a glass of wine with us and talk about it some more. Thanks very much indeed.